The neighborhood association threatened to take my house if I did not tear down the dam on my own property. So the next morning I called the state and told them I was ready to do exactly what they asked. The woman on the other end went quiet, then said, "Caleb, do they understand what that dam is holding back?" I looked through my kitchen window at 60 acres of still water shining under the morning fog and said, "No, Marianne, but they are about to." My name is Caleb Mercer. I was 64 years old when this happened, and before I retired, I spent 31 years working in watershed planning and emergency flood management for the state of Kentucky, which is a long way of saying I knew what water could do when people treated it like scenery instead of weight. I had moved back to my family's farm outside a little town called Bellwether after my wife Ellen passed away, bringing with me an old pickup, a stubborn black Labrador named Moose, and enough government filing boxes to make my son joke that I'd retired from the office but brought the office home. The property had belonged to my mother's family since the 1920s, and at the lower end of it sat Mercer Lake, held in place by an earthen dam my grandfather built with a county engineer in 1941. It was not beautiful in the polished postcard sense. The concrete spillway had weather stains, the old valve house leaned a little, and the gravel path across the crest had more weeds than gravel. But that dam had done its job quietly for more than 80 years. 3 miles downstream sat Silver Creek Estates, 72 expensive homes built along a low stretch of creek bottom and marketed as peaceful riverside living. The community had stone entrance pillars, matching mailboxes, and an HOA president named Vanessa Crowley, who had the sort of smile that made you check whether your wallet was still in your pocket. Vanessa's husband, Grant, had developed the subdivision 15 years earlier, and together they behaved as if every tree, driveway, fence, and cloud within 5 miles required their approval. For 4 years, Vanessa had complained about my dam. She called it ugly, outdated, dangerous, bad for property values, and once, during a county meeting, an industrial scar on an otherwise premium natural corridor, which was impressive language for a woman who had never walked farther up the creek than the wine patio behind her clubhouse. She filed complaints with the county, the state environmental office, and even a federal agency that politely informed her they had no jurisdiction over an old farm pond in central Kentucky. I ignored most of it because I'd spent my career dealing with people who believed a strongly worded email could change gravity. Then the certified letter arrived. It came in a thick cream envelope from an attorney in Lexington, and it demanded that I permanently decommission and breach the Mercer Lake Dam within 45 days or face legal action, property seizure, damages, and the forced sale of my home. I've read it twice, made coffee, read it again, then sat on the back porch where Ellen and I had planned to spend our retirement. There were 2 wooden rocking chairs there. I sat in mine. Hers was still empty. That lake had been the view she chose before she got sick. For a few minutes I wanted to tear the letter in half, drive down to Silver Creek, and tell Vanessa exactly what I thought of her little kingdom. But anger is useful only when it points you toward the right door. Mine pointed toward an old flood map locked in a gray cabinet in my study. I pulled it out, spread it across the dining table, and stared at the blue shaded area covering nearly every street in Silver Creek Estates. The subdivision had been approved under one critical assumption, that my dam would remain in place and continue reducing peak storm runoff. Without it, one ordinary heavy rain would push the creek over its banks and through the lowest homes. I had helped update that model myself 12 years earlier. Vanessa had demanded the removal of the one structure quietly protecting her neighborhood, and her husband, the developer who signed the original drainage certification, had every reason to know it. That was when I called Marianne Cole, my former colleague at the State Water Safety Office, and told her I wanted to file a legal decommissioning request. She asked whether I was bluffing. I told her no. I wanted every homeowner downstream notified by certified mail. I wanted the flood map attached, and I wanted the HOA given a clear chance to withdraw its demand. If they backed down, I would stop the process. If they did not, I would open the door they had spent 4 years pounding on. Marianne did not laugh, which was how I knew she understood exactly what I was proposing. She told me to come to Frankfort the next morning, so I drove in before sunrise with the HOA letter on the passenger seat and Moose snoring in the back like he had already heard enough about Vanessa Crowley to last a lifetime. Marianne met me in a conference room with 2 engineers, a legal advisor, and a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint. We went through the letter line by line, then laid my flood map beside the original drainage approval for Silver Creek Estates. One of the younger engineers leaned over the map, traced the blue flood zone with his finger, and said, "They built all of this assuming your reservoir stays active?" I said, "That is correct." He looked at the attorney's demand again and frowned, and now they are ordering you to remove it. I nodded. That is also correct. Marianne folded her arms and looked at me over her glasses. Caleb, once you file, the state has to notify every downstream property owner and open a public review. This is not a scare tactic. If the request stays active and the engineering checks out, we move forward. I told her I knew. What I did not say was that part of me hoped Vanessa would withdraw before the first envelope ever reached Silver Creek. I wanted her embarrassed, not buried. I wanted the threats to stop, not 72 families to learn that their homes had been sold to them under a dangerous assumption. Still, a threat against a man's home changes the temperature of a conversation. They had used legal language because they thought I would be frightened by it, and I had spent most of my adult life learning that legal language means exactly what it says when the wrong person signs it. I filed the application that afternoon. 3 days later, the HOA attorney called me. His name was Warren Pike, and he spoke in the slow, polished tone of a man who billed by the pause. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I believe there may be some confusion concerning the intent of our correspondence." I leaned back in my kitchen chair and looked at the letter lying beside me. "There's no confusion on my end, Mr. Pike." He cleared his throat. The association was seeking leverage for a negotiated improvement plan, perhaps cosmetic rehabilitation, reduce summer water levels, enhance pedestrian access across the structure. I said, "Your letter says permanently decommission and bridge the dam." He paused. "That language may have been stronger than necessary. You threatened to force the sale of my home." Another pause. "That was a standard remedies clause." It was standard enough for the state to accept it as a formal demand. His voice changed then, not much, but enough. The shine came off it. He asked what I wanted. I told him the HOA could submit a written withdrawal before the public review closed, and if they did, I would withdraw my application the same day. No damages, no public fight, no cameras, no humiliation. Just a clean end. Warren thanked me and said he would speak with his client. He called again that evening, sounding 20 years older. Vanessa had refused. According to him, she believed I was bluffing, and the state would never approve the removal. She had also told the board that backing down would weaken the HOA's authority over future disputes. That sentence told me more about her than 4 years of complaints ever had. This was no longer about the dam. It was about whether one retired widower at the top of the valley could make her look powerless. Warren withdrew as HOA counsel 2 days later. Vanessa replaced him with a larger firm, one where her brother-in-law happened to be a partner. Then the certified letters went out. Every homeowner in Silver Creek received the same packet, a notice of my decommissioning request, a plain language explanation of the process, and a color flood map showing how deep the water could rise on their property if the dam no longer reduced storm runoff. My son Luke drove through the subdivision that weekend and called me from his truck. "Dad," he said, "you should see this place." There were moving company vans on 3 streets, insurance inspectors standing in driveways, and neighbors arguing beside the clubhouse entrance. One woman had taped the flood map to the hood of her SUV and was pointing at Vanessa's house with a red marker. By Monday, the neighborhood had split into camps. Some residents demanded the HOA withdraw immediately. Others wanted to sue Greg Crowley because his development company had signed the original drainage documents. A third group wanted both. Vanessa responded by holding an emergency meeting and telling everyone the map was outdated, exaggerated, and prepared by people with a personal connection to me. That was technically true in the same way saying your surgeon knows you personally is true. I had worked with some of the people who reviewed the model, but numbers do not become false because you recognize the person carrying them. Silver Creek hired its own engineer, and according to a board member who later called me privately, that engineer reviewed the data for less than 2 hours before telling them the state model was conservative, not exaggerated. Vanessa refused to distribute his report. Instead, she stood in the clubhouse beneath a chandelier the size of a fishing boat and told 70 frightened homeowners, "Mr. Mercer is trying to punish this community because we asked him to maintain his property." That line made its way back to me by dinner. I remember sitting alone on the porch, hearing frogs near the water, and thinking how easily a lie can sound reasonable when it is spoken into a microphone. A week later, the county scheduled a public hearing. The room was packed before I arrived. Luke sat behind me, along with my daughter, Rachel, and her husband. Vanessa came in through a side door with 2 attorneys and took a seat in the 3rd row instead of at the HOA table. Grant did not appear at all. I later learned state investigators were already asking questions about the drainage certification he signed when Silver Creek was approved. For nearly 4 hours, homeowner after homeowner walked to the microphone. A retired teacher said she had spent her savings on a house she believed was outside the flood zone. A young father held up the map and asked why the HOA had never shown it to them. One man, still loyal to Vanessa, said the whole thing was government theater and accused me of using my connections to terrorize the neighborhood. I stood when my turn came and kept my hands flat on the podium because I did not trust them not to shake. I told them I had never asked to remove the dam. I told them I had maintained it at my own expense for years. I told them the HOA had threatened to seize my home unless I breached it, and I had offered them a way out before a single public notice was sent. Then I looked at Vanessa. Mrs. Beinathiksat. Crowley, I said, you have had 3 separate chances to withdraw your demand. You still have one more. She stood slowly, smoothed the front of her jacket, and said, the association will not be intimidated by you. There was a sound in the room then, not a gasp exactly, more like 200 people losing patience at once. The county board voted to formally urge the HOA to withdraw. The next night, Silver Creek's board met behind closed doors. The vote ended 3-3 with 1 abstention. Vanessa, as president, cast the deciding vote. She voted not to withdraw. At 7 the next morning, Marianne called me. Her voice was quiet. The demand remains active, she said. The state is moving to the final stage. I looked out across the lake, where mist was lifting off the surface in long silver ribbons. When? I asked. Saturday morning, she said. And Caleb, there is heavy rain in the forecast Saturday night. Marianne did not have to explain what the rain meant. I had spent half my life drawing lines on maps that showed where water would go after people made bad decisions, and now one of those lines was running straight through Silver Creek Estates. The state sent a final 48-hour notice to every homeowner, this time with updated rainfall projections and estimated flood depths printed beside each street name. Vanessa still refused to call another vote. According to a board member who recorded the conversation, she told them, the state is bluffing, Caleb is bluffing, and anybody truly concerned can put sandbags around their own property. Friday evening, Luke stopped by with his 8-year-old son Mason and found me sitting on the porch beside Ellen's empty rocking chair. Down near the dam, the state contractor had already parked 2 excavators and opened the old drain valve. Luke asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, which was the sort of lie fathers tell their sons when the truth would only give them something else to carry. After they left, I sat there until dark, watching the last light slide across the lake my grandfather had built, the lake Ellen had chosen as the view for the retirement we never got to share. I wanted Vanessa to lose her position. I wanted Grant exposed. I wanted every threat against my home withdrawn. But I did not want the lake gone. That was the part nobody downstream seemed to understand. At 6 the next morning, the first excavator cut into the eastern shoulder of the dam. State engineers stood beside me on the crest while muddy water rushed through the opening and the lake slowly lowered. By noon, old tree stumps began appearing along the shoreline, black and twisted after decades underwater. By 4 in the afternoon, the breach was complete. There was no celebration, no cheering, no dramatic speech, just the sound of water moving through raw earth and a white state truck pulling away as the sky turned gray. The rain began shortly after sunset. It came steady at first, then harder after midnight, tapping against my windows like fingers. I did not sleep. At 3 in the morning, I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and watched the creek gauge update on my laptop. At 4:22, the flow passed the warning threshold. At 4:39, the first emergency call came from Silver Creek. Water entered the lowest cul-de-sac before 5. By sunrise, rescue boats were moving between mailboxes and porch roofs. The sheriff had ignored Vanessa's request to stand down emergency crews, so firefighters, deputies, and paramedics were already waiting near the entrance when the water arrived. They evacuated children, elderly residents, pets, and one furious HOA president who had to climb from her upstairs window into a yellow rescue boat while 3 television cameras recorded the whole thing. Her stone house sat on the highest lot in the neighborhood, the lot Grant had quietly reserved for himself when he built Silver Creek. And even that house took nearly 3 feet of water on the first floor. 67 of the 72 homes were damaged. No one died, and that matters more than anything else I am about to say. But the financial damage ran into the millions. Most insurance claims were challenged because the residents had received repeated written warnings and the HOA had refused the one action that could have stopped the removal. Within a week, homeowners filed lawsuits against Grant's development company. State investigators found that he had approved Silver Creek using a drainage plan that depended on my dam while marketing the homes as naturally protected from flooding. Federal agents later searched his office and found emails showing he had known exactly what the original flood model said. Vanessa was removed as HOA president before the month ended. She and Grant were eventually charged with fraud-related offenses, lost their development licenses, and sold what remained of their property to cover legal settlements. The new HOA board offered to help rebuild my dam. I declined. The old lake bed became a protected wetland named after my grandfather, and by the following spring, ducks had returned, reeds were growing through the mud, and Mason found the first set of beaver tracks near the old spillway. I still sit in the right rocking chair most evenings. Bellen's chair stays empty beside me. Some people say I went too far, that I should have refused the HOA demand even after they threatened my home, because innocent families paid the price for Vanessa's arrogance. Others say I gave them every warning, every map, and every chance to stop what they had demanded. I still do not know which answer makes a man sleep better. I only know this: they ordered me to remove the dam. I followed the law, and the water followed gravity. So tell me honestly, was I wrong for giving the HOA exactly what it asked for, or was the real wrong committed years earlier by the people who built an entire neighborhood on a lie? Leave your verdict in the comments. Share the story with someone who has ever dealt with an HOA that confused authority with intelligence, and subscribe, because next time, the president of a gated community picks a fight with a widower, an old Cadillac, and a title she never bothered to read.